Hey everybody, James here with Modal Electronics. Welcome to Quick Dive. Today is all about MPE, MIDI Polyphonic Expression. You can get some really amazing things out of your Argon and your Cobalt synthesizers if you're using an MPE capable controller. If you've seen them, you know that they're definitely not your typical keybeds. They're not the FTAR keybeds. Usually they are made of different material, and they are of all sorts of different designs. Some of are squishy and foam, other ones are rubbery. Some of them are mechanical and move, in different directions. It's because MPE is such a much more personalized way of playing. There's really no rule. There's no rules on what's right and what's wrong. It's really about customizing the controller to fit your needs and finding the controller that you think would work best with what you want to do with the MPE controller. So with me today is a Keith McMillan Keyboard Pro 4, which slides conveniently out from underneath this COBALT8X that I'll be demonstrating it on. And first I want to show you this. The thinness of this is incredible. Look at that. So I wanted to show you a couple of examples of what they can do with the COBALT8X here, and maybe do a little bit of sound design, because it's a game changer. It changes the way you approach playing, and it changes the way that you think about designing your own sounds. So let's dive in. So first, I guess I'll start out by just playing a couple of neat presets here. This one's a brassy sort of pad. As you can see, it's very fun to play and very interactive because depending on how you have it set up, you can touch the keys in different areas and they'll react differently. And sound design on this thing to make that sort of thing happen is actually really easy because it uses existing parameters. It's not like you have to find some random CC value. You're using the Y plus or mod wheel as the forward and back. You're using the X plus and X minus if you one of the skilled keyboard players that actually can go left and right without touching the other note. And then you'll be using polyphonic aftertouch. The first app I wanted to show you actually is the Keyboard Pro 4 app, because it is very, very straightforward, and there's a lot of other apps out there that for each controller that are going to do something similar, but I just figured I'd show you this because this is the kind of thing you'll have to familiarize yourself with when you first get an MPE controller, just to make sure that you know how to actually configure it to something that you're going to be able to play effectively. So for me, one of the first presets I made involved boosting the threshold up to 60 because I thought the polyphonic aftertouch sensor was a bit too much for me. It was a bit too sensitive. So I put in a threshold. That way I can play and it won't trigger the aftertouch so easily, but it'll still be soft enough for me to do some very expressive, smooth sounding stuff. And it also has some adjustments that you can make on the fly as well. So right here, for example, this will adjust the amount of pitch bend range. So on the app, if I have it set to 12, then on the keyboard, this would be 0 and this would be 12. So it lets you, calculate, it lets you adjust stuff on the fly, and there's some flexibility to this. Of course, every controller is going to vary, but I just thought I'd show you a couple of the features of this Keyboard Pro 4 because they are pretty handy. Over here, you got pitch bend up and down, as well as octave select. As I mentioned earlier, it is very easy to get results And it's actually a different way of programming a patch, because you're not going to be as tempted to use like the modulation envelope, for example, or the LFOs, because to make sounds evolve, you just move your fingers around, and to do that, there's just a few variables that you'd want to have, being the modulation source, Y plus, and X plus, X minus, and aftertouch. So for this, naturally, I'm going to probably want oscillator 1A to do something cool when I slide it up. So in this case, when I do this, it is making the oscillator change its form, but if we change the algorithm, it'll do different things. That's one of my favorites right there, the pulse width modulation tri-pinch. That one's a neat one. Now, when you pair this with something called absolute mode, it is very fun. See, right here, you can have a different mode selected, something such as relative. Relative means when I put my finger down on it and move it up, that'll be when the mod wheel responds. But when you touch absolute, that is instantly jumping the mod wheel up to that value from the 0 point, which would be down here. So whereas relative, I'm actually touching it at different points of the keyboard, but relative is always going to measure it from the center. So it will jump up slightly, but it will go from the middle either upwards or downwards. It's a little trickier to work with relative, but it can be effective as well. I like to keep it on absolute, though. That's just an example of the kind of things you can tweak. Let's make aftertouch alter the mix of it. So if I pan this all the way maxed out to 63, when I push down on the keys, it's going to switch over to this oscillator. So we'll want to find something that sounds cool when you mix them together. Okay, that's cool. So why don't we add aftertouch modulates oscillator 2A. Okay, even better. Let's have an let's have an LFO modulate B2, and let's have it so aftertouch boosts up the depth of LFO2 doing that modulation. And let's add in some effects just for fun. Why not, right? I like ping pong delay, so there's some of that stuff can kind of trail off in some rhythmic fashion. For these last three mod slots, we could actually maximize the amount of modulation that's going on by capitalizing on LFO1. So we could have LFO1 dictate, let's see, maybe the cutoff. Now, keep in mind, LFO1 is a global LFO, so it's not actually going to be polyphonic, but it could still create some neat polyrhythms if we were doing something rhythmic. In this case, I'd probably just set LFO1 to like 16th notes to have just a little bit of a chug-a-lug to it in the background. Let's get those effects dialed back a little bit. And of course, if we do this, that means we can take LFO1's depth and we can drop it down to pretty much nothing and rely on this Y plus to increase the LFO1 depth. So that just means doing this. So as you can probably tell, sound design is very straightforward. It's just a couple of variables, and then after that, it's coming up with all sorts of creative, weird combinations of stuff to create these sonic evolving soundscapes that are dictated by your fingers. And just one more last thing before we close out. You might be wondering how this is all being done. This isn't running on like MIDI 2.0 or anything. MPE actually does things pretty cleverly. If you remember, the MIDI spec contains standard 16 channels, individual channels for queuing in notes, CC assignments, or CC modulation, that kind of stuff, right? Well, what MPE does is it takes those 16 channels and it designates one as a master channel, and then the remaining 15 are actually reserved for each note that you press. And since we only have 10 fingers, that actually works out quite nicely and leaves a little bit of room for some extras. But essentially what it's doing is, for example, for poly aftertouch, it's each channel has monophonic, one channel aftertouch. But when you press another note, now you're playing that note from MIDI channel 3, and the next note after that is being played from MIDI channel 4, et cetera, and so on and so on. So it's a really clever way of pulling off polyphonic control on a bunch of different levels. It essentially turns your mod wheel control into polyphonic per note, and et cetera, et cetera. Any kind of controls on your synthesizer that can be that are applicable to each note. So that would mean like polyphonic LFOs, envelopes, filters, that kind of thing. All of a sudden, they're now controllable with MPE, and that is the coolest part to me. Just remember that certain things that are global, like an LFO, LFO1 in this case, those are not polyphonic. So those are going to happen. Those are going to be doing their thing regardless of note. But nonetheless, when you combine those two together and kind of utilize both, it's even more interesting because some stuff you have that's consistent and playing. I'm speaking in terms of rhythmic kind of patches because that's my favorite kind of patch to make. But whether it's rhythmic or just a flowing kind of evolving sound, it's really neat to have a combination of the polyphonic control as well as traditional kind of modulation stuff that's just happening in the background, and the possibilities are just endless. But I hope you enjoyed it. If you are interested, by all means, post up in the comments. I can answer as many questions you have about the Keyboard Pro 4. And look out for another quick dive. I think we're going to be doing one here towards the end of the week or next week. And if you haven't checked out our Facebook page, go ahead and do that. And like and subscribe. Be sure to do that. And we'll see you on the next quick dive. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care.